Welcome, colleagues. I'm Lori Fuller, and this is Nicole Holland, and we're going to be discussing today why dismantling institutional racism in the academy is so difficult. We'll be starting today with a land acknowledgement. We know land acknowledgements are never enough, but they are one way that we can reflect upon our participation in settler colonialism. So today we invite you to acknowledge and pay respects to those who hold ancestral kinship with the land on which we're settlers. We recognize that the present United States is a collection of chopped up territories and land purchases accumulated by genocide. We also recognize that NEIU has a history of land grabs. Check out Bryn Mawr Avenue. Chicago exists because of settler colonialism and genocide, which forced the Treaty of Chicago in 1833. We are on the ancestral homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. And Chicago and Lake Michigan are sites of trade and healing for dozens of tribal nations, including Miami, Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, and Sauk. Indigenous people have migrated and cared for the land and water for millennia. Chicago is still home to one of the largest Native populations in the nation. We also invite you to pay respect to our African ancestors and recognize the legacy of the kidnapping and enslavement of African people and their unpaid labor, which contributed to the United States. Remembering the history and honoring the contributions and traditions of African and Indigenous people is one way to continue to reflect on settler colonialism and the history of the United States. So today we're going to be discussing a little introduction to why the work is important. I know you're here because you're interested in this topic too. We're going to be talking about some terms just so we're all on the same page. And then we're going to delve into the majority of our presentation will be how we can work to dismantle institutional racism.
As land acknowledgements remind us, the foundation of this nation is built on stolen land. Racial hegemony, which is this idea that one race is superior or dominant over others, enabled colonizers to displace, exploit, maim, and kill. The idea that racial hegemony is part of history is factually inaccurate and harmful. The residual effects of racial hegemony manifest themselves every day in every aspect of our lives, including healthcare, housing, employment and income opportunities, and yes, even education. While many want to believe that education is the great equalizer, and that it has the power to eradicate racial inequality, history continues to show us that this has not been the case. Educational institutions have historically excluded people of color and then reluctantly began to serve them. Even then, the type of education that members of racially diverse populations were able to receive was limited and sought to maintain the status quo of racial inequality. Again, the residual effects of this nation's educational past continue to manifest itself daily in schools and classrooms all across this nation, and Northeastern Illinois University is no exception. What makes institutional racism so difficult to dismantle in general, but specifically in the academy, is the fact that from generation to generation, there has been little or no critical examination of how racial inequality serves as the foundation for policies and practices. Thus, racialized policies and practices are often veiled as the standard or the right way of doing things. Further, attempts to interrogate or challenge these types of inequities are often met with resistance, confusion, and/or apathy. Each of us has a responsibility to begin chipping away at the inequitable policies and practices that do not favor the people that we serve. And while we think this work may be difficult and time-consuming, and it also might be uncomfortable, it is work that must be done, particularly by us, the faculty at a minority-serving institution. And if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? So let's talk a little bit about the context in which this work must happen. So this gives us a little snapshot of who our students are. And as you can see, institutional data from just last fall shows that we serve close to 70% of our students who are of color. Now let's take a closer look at the racial composition of our students. And it's not uncommon for us to hear this accolade that Northeastern is the most diverse university in the Midwest. And while diversity can be wonderful, we should acknowledge, at least internally, that this diversity is not necessarily due to intentionality, but more to accessibility. If we really want to tout the diversity of our students, we should also be institutionally committed to supporting them. So the first couple of columns here you'll see indicates that more than a third of our students identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx students. And then you see the rest of the wonderful diversity that we have at Northeastern. I want to alert you to a second set of numbers. These numbers represent white faculty at Northeastern. While we have a dedicated faculty of all races and cultural backgrounds, the diversity of our faculty does not reflect the diversity of our students. And so it is important when we think about dismantling institutional racism that the faculty members who generally have the greatest and most frequent interactions with our students are critically conscious around issues of race. And so now we'd like to share a few definitions and terms that will be useful for you to consider throughout our presentation.
Yes, we thought getting on the same page about what contributes to the difficulty of dismantling racism would be important. So I also have on the slide a really beautiful piece of artwork by Ricardo Levines Morales with a quote from an Aboriginal activist about how our liberation is tied up together. So I want to start with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talk about DEI work a lot. And for Dr. Holland and I, we want to make sure we recognize that diversity is not just about race, although we'll be focusing on race today, but it's talking about all the ways in which we are full human beings, the ways in which we have different gender identities, different sexuality, different class background. Disability politics are really important to think about. I've been trying to change my use of the word crazy as one way to transform thinking about the politics around disability and ability. We use the term equity to talk about what people need to have to enable them to fully participate. How can we welcome everyone's full human beingness? How can we welcome the ways in which people might need different things to be able to participate? And we want to include people at our university, all of our students. As Dr. Holland showed, our students bring so many different backgrounds, racial and class, experiences with education, ages, and we want to make sure that our students feel welcomed and belong. So we also want to just highlight this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. It's a great book. He really delves into the ideas about racism and anti-racism. And his point is that we cannot be neutral in work that is to dismantle racism. There is no, I'm not racist. There's either we're racist or we're anti-racist. And we're here today to tell you we are working on being anti-racist, and we hope you are joining us in acknowledging that we need to actively be anti-racist in order to transform Northeastern Illinois University. So the next thing I want to talk about is addressing whiteness. As a white person, I'm really taught about how my ideas, my beliefs are great. I feel like I have advice. I'm a good person. I know I'm good and I have good advice because I've been told by culture and society that whiteness is a value, that it has value. So I feel comfortable with my advice, with being asked for what my opinion is. And what has happened is that these ways in which white people are superior, I almost never recognize in myself, and I almost never recognize in the systemic way that it's been incorporated. And that's why we have this point on white standardization, because white supremacy culture, as you can see, standardize on the left-hand side of the slide here, many things that we value in Northeastern and in our systems. My articles that I've written by myself are more valuable than ones that I do collectively because we value individualism. We're really interested in quantity. How many articles have I published? Not whether or not there's an article that has been transformative. We're not good with conflict. As a white person, I get really defensive when someone mentions something about race. I get uncomfortable. And that's why we think this slide is so great, because it's looking at these antidotes that we can use. Our last slide in the presentation is going to have documents that you might use as resources, and some of them mention these restorative antidotes, how we can respond to our trained white supremacy culture frames to make them more inclusive, more equity-based, welcoming diversity of the ways in which people experience things. But unfortunately, as a white person, I am not so great at talking about race, and white people are trained not to be great at talking about race. I can become silent. I can become checked out when people raise issues about race. I might need to see the data. I feel uncomfortable. I could cry. We've seen things in the news about white women, especially crying or calling the police when things come up around race that's really uncomfortable. So one of our points, and I just like to emphasize this, is that we need to get more comfortable talking about race and racism. We need to get more comfortable engaging in these difficult dialogues, because that is something that we can do to transform institutional racism.
And although dismantling institutional racism is difficult, and it is a major undertaking, there are some things that we can do as a faculty. We would like to share some of these strategies that all faculty should use, and we'd like to begin by focusing on the lens through which faculty should do their work. Estella Benjamin and her colleagues at the Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California encourage educational practitioners to engage in their work through the lens of equity-mindedness. The goal of this approach is to identify and dismantle the individual and institutional patterns in policies and practice that contribute to systemic racial inequities, particularly as they affect student outcomes. Some of the key elements of this approach include being critically race conscious. And when I think about this approach, I think about entering into all interactions, being aware that race either explicitly or implicitly plays some role. There is no such thing as being colorblind. And by failing to acknowledge that being colorblind is an elusive and unattainable concept, we are doing ourselves and others harm. Being critically race conscious could be as simple as providing a historically accurate context for the implications of race in the work that you do, even if that means talking about the absence or paucity of scholars of color in your field and the implications of that. Other aspects of this work include taking the time to interrogate content and process, what we teach, how we teach, how might these be racialized, what types of assumptions, knowledge, and beliefs are being presented, and how do they center some people and marginalize and silence others. Once you consider your content and your pedagogical approaches, you must consistently rethink and reshape them in order to move forward towards more equity-minded outcomes. So we want to take the last part of this presentation to discuss how faculty can approach teaching and learning from an equity-minded focus. So the first thing we want to talk about is creating a culturally responsive and inclusive classroom environment. We want to think about asset-based lenses. Again, due to the hegemony of our society, some races and cultures are elevated, while others are marginalized and silenced. Be sure that you are elevating all students and everything that students bring to the classroom and our university. Acknowledge their strengths and scaffold their learning expectations. Provide them with opportunities for success that you will support. Reassure students that trial and error are common for all learners and provide them with academic and emotional support for their learning. So that might be something as simple as asking them to go to the writing center or to work with a tutor. Think about the language that you use. Be mindful that certain words and phrases and idiomatic expressions have meanings that are not apparent or easily transferable. Even if you are using jargon that's common to your discipline or to the career in which students might want to enter, be sure to explain words, phrases, and terms, and make sure students understand those words and those phrases and how to use them. When we receive feedback from students regarding race-related experiences, whether that be something that we've said or something that we've done, whether that's intentional or unintentional, whether that's in class or elsewhere on the campus, whether it's something that you were privy to or not, please be responsive. Remember, we are often the first line of defense for our students. Whether you receive this information verbally, whether that be in class or during office hours or in passing, or in writing, student evaluations, try to focus on the student's perspective. Don't get defensive and don't try to explain away the situation. Just try to address it from an equity-minded perspective. If you feel you're too close to that situation or you're not really sure how to proceed, then seek help, which Dr. Fuller and I will talk about a little bit later on in this presentation. You can seek help from other colleagues within the institution or even beyond. We have mentioned here the equity-minded syllabus, and while that's a very important piece, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because our Center for Teaching and Learning that is led by Dr. Sandra Beta-Laurie offers some really wonderful workshops throughout each academic semester to help faculty review and revise their syllabi to be equity-minded. I will say that the syllabus is often the first document students receive from faculty, and it serves as an indicator of what the student-teacher relationship may be like, and as a contract as to how that relationship may develop. So in general, you may want to make sure that all of your students feel welcome into your courses. Let them know that you expect and believe that they will be successful. Let them know how, where, and what types of academic supports are available. And be clear in your language and your directions and instructions. However, I do want to spend a little time discussing culturally responsive texts and materials. When we're addressing institutional racism in the academy, it requires us to address the white supremacist culture in teaching and learning. One concrete way to do that is to reevaluate and reconsider the texts and other materials you use in your courses. If your course materials exclusively reflect a white person's perspective, particularly a white male perspective, acknowledge that and supplement those perspectives with equally important and valuable perspective of diverse scholars. If this process is difficult for you or stymies you in any way, again, contact colleagues in your program, department, or elsewhere throughout the university who are doing this work and seek that type of advice. This is also the reason that we belong to professional organizations outside of Northeastern, because that is another great way of finding work that represents the contemporary and diverse perspectives in your own fields. When you think about students and how they feel and how they believe, oftentimes by having course materials that reflect diverse perspectives, it helps students become more engaged with course content, and it helps them see themselves as being successful in the course and maybe even that profession. When we think about connections, having a diverse perspective is really important in course materials because it helps students see what they're learning and how it's related not only to themselves, but to their families and to their communities. This can aid in the legitimacy and the applicability of what they are learning when they understand how the material stretches beyond the course and into their homes and their communities. And finally, these conversations are so important, regardless if you have a class with students representing diverse racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds, and all the other types that Dr. Fuller acknowledged earlier, or whether these students appear to be homogeneous. Teaching and learning should always be done through the lens of a historical, social, political, and educational accuracy, as well as using critically conscious, equity-minded approaches.
Thank you so much for that. So building on what Dr. Holland said earlier, we think it's really important to recognize the asset-based lens as opposed to deficit. I often think about how we talk about our students as a way that frames how we're able to think about them. And it's very common at Northeastern to hear people say that our students are unprepared. I think it's really does a disservice to all the ways that our students have had to navigate culture and society to even make it to our doors at Northeastern. They have so many skills, and reframing them being unprepared to them having so many assets that they can use to excel in the classroom is one way that we can change and dismantle the institutional ways in which we've been taught to think about our students. This then bleeds into the language that we use to talk to the students, to talk about diversity. It bleeds into thinking about what position that we have, how we talk to each other, how we talk to staff. It's really a whole systemic change, which is why being mindful of how white supremacy culture shows up is so important. It shows up in standards and policies and how we can change those. I think another thing that we want to emphasize is that this is imperfect and never-ending work. We continue to learn as faculty, as human beings, about the ways in which race, sexuality, gender identity, ability, age shows up in discriminatory thinking and discriminatory behavior in our classrooms and with our colleagues. These are teachable moments. If we can take in the information that we get when we mistake, say something wrong, underestimate or change how the world is shaping us, we need to go to critical colleagues to help us think about the ways in which we can unlearn or change. Also, we want to encourage you to join us in these collective institutional efforts. There's so many organizing projects happening at Northeastern right now around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Go to your critical colleagues and bring them with you to come and join us doing change work on campus. And the last thing we want to talk about reflecting on the process is recognizing that we need to be caring and compassionate to ourselves and others. The first thing I tell my students in women's gender and sexuality studies is that patriarchy has taught you to hate yourself. And one way to resist patriarchy, and I would expand to white supremacy, capitalism, sexism, is to resist self-hatred and deal with ourselves and each other in a compassionate way. We are neither good or bad people, but we are people working to end institutional racism at Northeastern.
And Dr. Fuller and I are very excited that there is a new era at Northeastern Illinois University. During this past summer, Dr. Shireen Rashan was hired as our Executive Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I hope that I didn't do too much of a butchering of her last name, but we are thrilled to have her. And we really do hope that as a collective, we start to work more institutionally towards diversity, equity, and inclusion at Northeastern Illinois University.
We just wanted to recognize all the other units and initiatives that are promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion right now on Northeastern's campus that you can join. We know we probably don't have all the groups and systems, but I think it's so important to recognize the work that is being done. And our last slide has resources that you might want to access. These ones, obviously, you can pause this video to write down the information. And these are the resources that we've drawn upon. The information on antidotes to white supremacy culture comes from the Center for Community Organizations, White Supremacy Culture. And it's a really cool document that has antidotes to perfectionism and other ways we've been taught that white supremacy is the way to think about how the world works. And these other articles are also really amazing too. So I hope you'll join me and Dr. Holland in continuing the work to dismantle racism at Northeastern Illinois University. Thank you.